The old soldier, Jonas Parker, stood in the cold pre-dawn darkness of the 19th of April, 1775, on a small triangular green in Lexington, Massachusetts, and made a decision that would define the final moments of his life. At 53 years old, Jonas was not young, not spry, and certainly not blind to what he saw approaching down the road from Boston. Through the rising light of dawn, some 700 British regulars, in their crimson coats and white crossbelts, marched toward him in a column, half a mile long, bayonets fixed, drums beating, fifes playing, their breath misting in the 46-degree morning air. Jonas had perhaps 36 men around him, farmers and mechanics mostly, their muskets loaded with powder and ball, standing in two ragged ranks on the village common. He placed his hat on the ground between his feet, filled it with extra musket balls and flints, and declared to those within earshot that he would never run. Whatever happened next, Jonas Parker had chosen his ground. Within minutes, he would be wounded in the first British volley, struggle to his knees to reload his musket, and die there, on the grass, with a British bayonet through his body. He was one of 8 men killed that morning in a confused, chaotic exchange of gunfire that lasted perhaps 15 minutes. And yet that brief, bloody skirmish on Lexington Green, combined with the battle that followed at Concord's North Bridge and the 18-mile running fight back to Boston, would echo across centuries, launching a war that created a nation and transforming a local Massachusetts dispute into what Ralph Waldo Emerson would later immortalize as the shot heard round the world. This is the story of what really happened on that April morning 250 years ago, told through the eyes of the men and women who lived it, fought it, and died for it. The gunfire at Lexington Green did not erupt from nowhere. It was the bloody culmination of a decade of escalating tensions between Great Britain and her American colonies, tensions rooted in questions of taxation, representation, sovereignty, and the fundamental nature of the relationship between mother country and colonial subjects. To understand why Jonas Parker chose to stand his ground on that cold April morning, we must first understand the world that had made such a stand seem necessary. The seeds of revolution were planted in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763 with Britain's decisive victory over France. The war had been staggeringly expensive, leaving Britain with a national debt that had nearly doubled. From London's perspective, the American colonies had been the primary beneficiaries of British military protection against French encroachment, and it seemed only reasonable that they should contribute to the costs of their own defense. Parliament's solution was a series of revenue measures that would transform loyal British subjects into determined revolutionaries within little more than a decade. The Stamp Act of 1765 struck first. It required colonists to pay a tax on virtually every piece of printed paper they used, from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards and dice. The tax was to be paid in British sterling, not colonial currency, and violators could be prosecuted in vice admiralty courts without the protection of jury trials. Parliament intended to raise £60,000 annually, roughly 17% of the cost of maintaining 10,000 British soldiers in North America. What they raised instead was a fury that surprised everyone, including the colonists themselves. In Boston, a group calling themselves the Sons of Liberty organized to resist the tax. Their methods ranged from political pressure to outright mob violence. On the 14th of August 1765, they hanged an effigy of Andrew Oliver, the designated stamp distributor, from the branches of what became known as the Liberty Tree. That evening, a crowd destroyed Oliver's offices and ransacked his home, drinking his entire wine cellar in the process. 12 days later, the mob turned on Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, stripping his mansion of £250,000 worth of possessions and leaving it a gutted shell. The Sons of Liberty included men who would later stand at Lexington and Concord, men whose names would become synonymous with American independence. Samuel Adams, a failed tax collector with a genius for political organization, served as their unofficial leader. Paul Revere, A skilled silversmith and artisan produced inflammatory engravings depicting British tyranny and served as the group's primary courier. John Hancock, one of the wealthiest merchants in Massachusetts and a notorious smuggler of untaxed goods, provided financial backing and social respectability. These men formed the nucleus of what would become America's first organized resistance movement. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March 1766, but the victory was hollow. On the same day, they passed the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The principle of parliamentary supremacy remained intact, and the cycle of provocation and resistance continued. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea imported into the colonies. The revenue would be used to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, making them independent of colonial assemblies and answerable only to the Crown. More ominously, the acts granted customs officials broad powers of search and seizure through general warrants, known as writs of assistance. Samuel Adams organized boycotts of British goods. Merchants across Massachusetts signed non-importation agreements. And in October 1768, 4,000 British troops landed in Boston, 1 soldier for every 4 civilians, to enforce order and protect customs collectors. The presence of so many armed men in a city of 15,000 created constant friction. Soldiers competed with civilians for scarce jobs in the depressed post-war economy. Brawls erupted regularly between redcoats and the young men who worked along Boston's rope walks. On the 5th of March 1770, one such confrontation escalated into tragedy. A crowd gathered outside the Custom House on King Street, pelting the single sentry with snowballs, ice, and oyster shells. More soldiers arrived. Someone threw a club that knocked a soldier to the ground. And then, in circumstances that remained disputed for decades afterward, the soldiers opened fire into the crowd, killing 5 colonists, including Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave who had become a merchant sailor. Paul Revere produced an engraving of the event within 3 weeks, depicting well-ordered British soldiers firing on command into a peaceful crowd. It was propaganda of the highest order, and it worked brilliantly. The Boston Massacre, as it quickly became known, transformed local resistance into something approaching a revolutionary movement. Thousands attended the funeral procession for the victims. Annual commemorations kept the memory raw for years afterward, and yet the true turning point was still 3 years away. The Tea Act of May 1773 seemed innocuous enough. It allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out American middlemen and actually reducing the price of legally imported tea. But the act left in place the old Townshend duty of 3 pence per pound, a symbolic assertion of Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. For Samuel Adams and his allies, the principle mattered more than the price. On the evening of the 16th of December, 1773, somewhere between 60 and 150 men, crudely disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships at Griffin's Wharf and systematically dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The cargo was worth approximately 10,000 pounds, close to $2 million in modern terms. When news reached John Adams the next morning, he wrote in his diary that it was the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened. Parliament's response was swift and punishing. The coercive acts known in America as the Intolerable Acts arrived in the spring of 1774 as a package designed to bring Massachusetts to heel. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act essentially revoked the colony's charter, making almost all government positions Crown-appointed and limiting town meetings to 1 per year. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, far from hostile colonial juries. And the Quartering Act required colonists to house British troops in unoccupied buildings throughout the colonies. General Thomas Gage arrived in Boston on the 13th of May, 1774, aboard HMS Lively, carrying his commission as both military commander and royal governor of Massachusetts. He found a province on the edge of open rebellion. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had already begun meeting in defiance of British authority, first in Salem, then in Concord. Local militias were drilling with increasing frequency. Committees of correspondence linked towns across the colony, coordinating resistance and sharing intelligence. And throughout the countryside, in barns and cellars and hidden caches, military supplies were accumulating: muskets, powder, shot, bayonets, cannon, and the 1,000 other implements of war. The powder alarm of the 1st of September, 1774, provided a preview of what was to come. Before dawn that morning, 250 British soldiers rode up the Mystic River and seized 250 half-barrels of gunpowder from the provincial powder house in what is now Somerville. The response stunned everyone, including the British. Within 2 days, between 4,000 and 60,000 armed militiamen had converged on the roads leading to Boston, responding to rumors false, as it turned out, that British troops had fired on civilians and that war had begun. The alarm spread 40 miles in a single night. By the time the militiamen learned that no one had been killed, they were already demonstrating their capacity for rapid mobilization. General Gage wrote home that if he was forced to act, it must be on a very large scale. For to begin with, small numbers will encourage resistance and not terrify. The winter of 1774 to 1775 brought an arms race to Massachusetts. British patrols probed into the countryside, searching for military stores. Colonial spies monitored every movement in Boston. Paul Revere rode repeatedly between Boston and Concord, carrying intelligence and helping to organize what amounted to an early warning system. In February 1775, Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. On April 14, General Gage received orders from Secretary of State Lord Dartmouth to take decisive action against the rebel leaders and their military preparations. By mid-April, the stage was set. Thousands of muskets, barrels of powder, artillery pieces, and military provisions were hidden in and around Concord, 20 miles from Boston. Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying at the parsonage of Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington, directly on the road from Boston to Concord. The British had the intelligence, the orders, and the troops. What they lacked was the element of surprise. The week before the 19th of April, 1775, was marked by visible preparations on both sides and increasingly urgent intelligence gathering. In Boston, observant colonists noticed British grenadiers and light infantry being quietly relieved from routine duties. Navy longboats were moved from their usual positions and clustered near the warships anchored in the harbor. These were the unmistakable signs of an impending expedition, and the Patriot spy network in Boston reported every detail to Dr. Joseph Warren, the 33-year-old physician who served as chairman of the Committee of Safety. Warren was a man of remarkable energy and courage. Widowed at 32 with 4 young children, he had emerged as one of the most effective Patriot leaders in Massachusetts, delivering inflammatory orations, commemorating the Boston Massacre, and drafting the Suffolk Resolves that called for armed resistance to British authority. On April 16, 2 days before the British march, Warren dispatched Paul Revere to Lexington with a warning that British troops might move at any moment. Revere delivered the message to Samuel Adams and John Hancock, then continued to Concord to verify that the military supplies there were being properly dispersed and hidden. During this ride, Revere met with local Patriot leaders in Charlestown to establish a signal system in case he was unable to leave Boston when the British moved. The plan was simple. Signal lanterns hung in the steeple of Christ Church, the tallest building in Boston's North End, visible across the water to watchers in Charlestown. 1 lantern if the British marched out by land over Boston Neck, 2 lanterns if they crossed the Charles River by boat. The famous phrase, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, refers not to Revere watching for a signal, but to Revere ordering a signal to be set as a backup communication method. On April 18, the waiting ended. General Gage had received intelligence from a spy within the provincial Congress. Most historians believe it was Dr. Benjamin Church, later exposed as a traitor, indicating that rebel supplies at Concord were vulnerable and that the provincial Congress was divided on how to respond to a British move. Gage issued orders for a nighttime march to Concord to seize and destroy the military stores. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment of Foot would command the expedition, with Major John Pitcairn of the 1st Battalion of Marines as his second in command. The force assembled was significant. Approximately 700 men drawn from the elite flank companies of 11 different regiments. These were not ordinary infantrymen but specially selected grenadiers, the tallest, strongest soldiers in each regiment, and light infantry, mobile troops trained in skirmishing and flanking operations. Each man carried a long land-pattern musket, the famous Brown Bess, with its 75 caliber bore and 17-inch triangular bayonet. They were professional soldiers of one of the most powerful armies in the world. Yet even before the expedition departed, its secrecy had been compromised. Throughout the afternoon, Warren's sources reported unusual activity. Senior officers conferring at Province House, supply boats being prepared, officers checking their weapons. By early evening, Warren was certain that the British were about to move in force. Between 9 and 10 o'clock that night, he summoned Paul Revere to his meeting place and gave him the fateful order: ride to Lexington, warn Adams and Hancock, then continue to Concord to alert the militia there. As insurance against Revere's capture, Warren also dispatched William Dawes, a 30-year-old tanner, by a different route. Dawes would take the longer land route over Boston Neck, relying on his reputation among the British Guards to pass unchallenged. Revere would take the shorter but more dangerous water route, rowing across the Charles River to Charlestown and then riding through the countryside. The British troops began assembling on Boston Common around 9:30 that evening. There was confusion from the start. The Navy had not provided enough boats to transport all 700 men at once, forcing the soldiers to make 2 crossings and adding hours of delay. The troops waded through tidal marshes at Lechmere Point, some struggling through water up to their waists, their white gaiters and crossbelts soaked in the darkness. It was nearly 1:30 in the morning before the column finally began its march toward Lexington. By then, the countryside was already alive with warning. Revere had crossed the Charles River around 11 o'clock, narrowly slipping past the 64-gun warship HMS Somerset, anchored in the shipping channel. In Charlestown, he borrowed a horse from a merchant named John Larkin and set off at a gallop through Medford, alerting militia Captain Isaac Hall and, as he later wrote, alarming almost every house along his route. At each farmstead, lights flickered on. Men reached for muskets, hung above doorways. Wives helped buckle cartridge boxes and powder horns, while children watched wide-eyed from bed. William Dawes, meanwhile, had talked his way past the British Guards at Boston Neck and was riding hard through Roxbury and Brookline toward Lexington. The 2 riders arrived within half an hour of each other, sometime after midnight. Revere reached the parsonage where Adams and Hancock were staying first, confronting the guard sergeant William Monroe with a dramatic announcement. "Noise! You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars are coming out." Inside the Clark parsonage, chaos ensued. John Hancock, stubborn and proud, initially declared he would stay and fight. Samuel Adams, more practical, convinced him that their capture would deliver an incalculable propaganda victory to the British. The 2 leaders prepared to flee, while Revere and Dawes, after refreshing themselves briefly, set out again toward Concord to verify the military stores were secure. About a mile outside Lexington, they encountered Dr. Samuel Prescott, a young Concord physician who was riding home after visiting his fiancée, Lydia Mulligan, in Lexington. Prescott was, as Revere later described him, a high son of liberty, and he offered to join the riders, noting that, as a local man, the Concord residents would be more likely to trust him than strangers riding at midnight with tales of British invasion. The decision to bring Prescott proved crucial. Around 1:30 in the morning, a British patrol intercepted all 3 riders near the town of Lincoln. At gunpoint, a British major demanded to know who they were and where they were going. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Prescott spurred his horse toward a stone wall and leaped it cleanly, disappearing into the swampy woods he had known since childhood. Dawes attempted a similar escape, but was thrown from his horse and had to continue on foot back to Lexington. Revere was captured and held at gunpoint. In the darkness, the British officers interrogated their prisoner roughly. Revere, with characteristic boldness, told them everything: that the alarm had been given, that 500 militiamen were already assembling, and that their expedition had lost all advantage of surprise. The officers were rattled but disbelieving until gunfire echoed from the direction of Lexington. Captain Parker, assembling his militia on the town green, had ordered a volley to clear their weapons before dismissing the men to await further developments. The British patrol, mistaking this for hostile action, released Revere and galloped toward Lexington to warn the approaching column. Revere walked back to the Clark parsonage and helped Adams and Hancock finish their escape to the neighboring town of Burlington. The only rider who actually reached Concord that night was Samuel Prescott. He roused the town around 2 o'clock in the morning, then continued riding west to alert the militia companies in Acton and Stowe. His brother Abel took the alarm to Sudbury and Framingham. Across Middlesex County, the network of riders, church bells, drumbeats, and signal guns that Paul Revere had helped establish spread the warning at remarkable speed. By dawn, militia companies were assembling in dozens of towns, their members grabbing muskets, powder horns, and cartridge boxes before rushing to join their neighbors on village greens throughout eastern Massachusetts. Captain John Parker had spent most of the night waiting. At 45 years old, he was a veteran of the French and Indian War who had fought at the Siege of Louisbourg and the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, campaigns that had helped make Britain the dominant power in North America. Now he stood on Lexington Green in the pre-dawn cold, terminally ill with tuberculosis, his raspy voice barely audible above the chatter of his assembled men, waiting for enemies who might or might not be coming. The initial alarm had reached Lexington around 1 o'clock in the morning. Parker mustered his company on the common. About 130 men answered the first call and then faced a decision. The British column was reportedly hours away, and there was no certain intelligence about its route or objective. After consultation with his officers, Parker dismissed most of his men with orders to stay within earshot of the meeting-house bell and to reassemble immediately when summoned. Many of the militiamen retired to nearby Buckman Tavern, a 2-story establishment just across the road from the Green, where they could drink flip, a popular mixture of rum and beer, while they waited. For more than 3 hours, nothing happened. Parker sent scouts down the road toward Boston, but they returned with conflicting reports. Some said the British were coming. Others saw no sign of them. By 4 o'clock in the morning, Parker himself was beginning to doubt whether the alarm had been accurate. Then, around 4:15, the last scout, Thaddeus Bowman, galloped up with definitive news. The regulars were approaching in force and were nearly upon them. William Diamond, the company's 16-year-old drummer, beat the long roll that summoned the militia to assembly. Men emerged from Buckman Tavern, from nearby homes, from barns and outbuildings around the Green. Approximately 77 militiamen formed in 2 loose ranks near the northwestern corner of the triangular common. Between 40 and 100 spectators, townspeople who had gathered to watch, stood at the edges of the Green and in doorways along the road. What Parker intended to accomplish with his small force remains uncertain. He clearly did not plan to stop 700 British soldiers with fewer than 80 men. His own deposition, given 6 days later, stated that he concluded not to be discovered, nor meddle or make with said regular troops, if they should approach, unless they should insult or molest us. The traditional quote, attributed to Parker. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here, was recalled by one of his men decades after the fact, and does not appear in any contemporary source. More likely, Parker wanted simply to make a statement. The militia of Lexington would not run and hide while British soldiers marched through their town. They would stand, armed and visible, as a silent assertion of their rights as Englishmen. Then, they would step aside and let the column pass. It was a political gesture, not a military tactic. Around 5 o'clock, the British advance guard appeared at the eastern edge of the town. Major John Pitcairn rode at the head of 6 companies of light infantry, approximately 238 men. The main body of the column, with Lieutenant Colonel Smith and the Grenadier companies, was still some distance behind. What Pitcairn saw as he approached Lexington was a small group of armed men standing in formation on the village green, directly adjacent to the road his column would travel. The British officers interpreted this as a challenge. Instead of marching past the militiamen on the road, the first 2 companies of light infantry wheeled onto the green itself, deploying into a line of battle facing Parker's men. More companies followed, until several hundred soldiers were crowded onto the triangular common in some disorder. Officers on horseback shouted conflicting commands. Soldiers loaded their muskets against orders. Their weapons should have been loaded already, and fixed bayonets. Pitcairn himself rode forward, calling out commands to the militiamen. Accounts differ on his exact words. Some witnesses heard, "Lay down your arms, you damned rebels." Others recalled, "Disperse, ye rebels, disperse," or "Throw down your arms and ye shall come to no harm." What all accounts agree on is that Pitcairn ordered his own men not to fire, shouting commands to surround and disarm them. Captain Parker, seeing his small company now facing an overwhelming force of professional soldiers, ordered his men to disperse. Some began to drift away from the green, though most still carried their muskets. Others stood their ground, perhaps unable to hear Parker's raspy voice over the shouting. The scene was tense, chaotic. Soldiers and militiamen alike yelling. Officers trying to maintain control of troops who were exhausted from a night march and keyed up for a confrontation. And then someone fired a shot. After 250 years of investigation, we still do not know who fired that shot. We almost certainly never will. American depositions uniformly blamed the British, claiming that officers discharged pistols or that soldiers fired without orders. British accounts insisted that shots came from behind a stone wall near the meeting house, or from a tavern window, or from militiamen jumping over a fence as they dispersed. Major Pitcairn himself told anyone who would listen, up until his death at Bunker Hill 2 months later, that the Americans had fired first, but he also admitted that in the confusion, he had not actually seen who fired. The most plausible explanation is that no one deliberately started the shooting. The evidence suggests an accidental discharge or a shot from someone outside the disciplined formations on both sides, a nervous spectator, perhaps, or a militiaman whose finger slipped on his trigger. What we know for certain is that once the first shot sounded, events cascaded beyond anyone's control. British soldiers fired a ragged, disorganized volley without orders. Some of Parker's men returned fire. Others ran for cover. The shooting was brief but intense, with muskets banging in the morning air, powder smoke obscuring vision, and men falling on the grass. The militia broke and scattered. British soldiers charged with bayonets, pursuing fleeing Americans across the green and into the fields beyond. Officers on both sides screamed for their men to cease fire. When Lieutenant Colonel Smith arrived with the main body of the column, he found chaos. His soldiers were scattered across the green, chasing militia into the surrounding area, some looting abandoned haversacks. Smith ordered a drummer to beat 2 arms, the recognized signal for troops to form up and restore order. Gradually, the soldiers reassembled into their companies. The firing stopped. 8 Americans lay dead or dying on Lexington Green. 10 more were wounded. Among the dead was Jonas Parker, the 53-year-old who had sworn never to run. Wounded in the first volley, he had dropped to his knees and attempted to reload his musket from the supply of balls and flints in his hat. He was bayoneted before he could fire a shot. Jonathan Harrington, another of the fallen, had been shot in the chest as he fled across the green. He managed to crawl to the doorstep of his own house, where his wife Ruth and 8-year-old son watched him die at their feet. On the British side, only one soldier was wounded, a minor injury to his leg. Major Pitcairn's horse had been struck twice but remained standing. The disparity in casualties reflected the one-sided nature of the engagement, a brief, brutal attack on a small, outnumbered force that had been trying to withdraw. Smith allowed his men to fire a victory volley and give 3 cheers before resuming the march to Concord. Behind them, the surviving Lexington militiamen emerged from hiding and began to gather their dead. Captain Parker, whose company had just been shattered, immediately began planning his revenge. The British column reached Concord around 7 o'clock in the morning, 6 hours behind schedule, and now marching through a countryside that knew they were coming. As they entered the town, soldiers cut down the Liberty Pole that stood in the center square, a symbolic act that did nothing to improve the mood of the watching townspeople. Lieutenant Colonel Smith immediately divided his force to accomplish the mission Gage had assigned him, locating and destroying the military supplies cached in and around Concord. The tactical situation was challenging. The supplies were scattered across multiple locations. Colonel James Barrett's farm, about 2 miles west of town, held the largest cache, including buried cannon and hidden ammunition. Additional stores were concealed in various houses and outbuildings throughout Concord. Smith needed to search systematically, while also securing his lines of communication back to Boston and guarding against the militia forces he knew were gathering in the surrounding hills. He divided his command accordingly. 1 company would hold the South Bridge over the Concord River. Captain Lawrence Parsons would take 7 companies of light infantry across the North Bridge to search Barrett's farm. 3 additional companies under Captain Walter Laurie of the 43rd Regiment would remain at the North Bridge itself, securing Parsons' route back to town. The rest of the Force Grenadiers and Marines would search Concord and protect the main body. Colonel James Barrett had been preparing for this day for months. At 65 years old, he was the senior militia officer in the Concord area, a veteran of the French and Indian War who had fought at Oswego, Fort Ticonderoga, and Crown Point. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had charged him with collecting and securing the colony's military stores, and he had done so with a thoroughness that now frustrated British searchers. Most of the supplies had been dispersed in the weeks before April 19. 4 brass cannon had been dragged 20 miles to Groton. Muskets were buried in plowed furrows on farmland throughout the area. Ammunition and provisions were hidden in cellars, attics, and outbuildings across a 30-mile radius. When Barrett received word of the British approach around 3 in the morning, his wife Rebecca rushed through their farmhouse, stuffing musket balls, cartridges, and flints into casks and covering them with feathers to evade any search. By the time Parsons' men reached the farm, they found almost nothing of military value. Back in Concord, the search parties had more success but still fell far short of expectations. They destroyed 3 cannon, knocking off the trunnions that allowed the guns to be aimed, along with gun carriages, entrenching tools, and barrels of provisions. Some soldiers set fire to the debris, including a pile of wooden spoons and trenchers that had been collected for the use of a future colonial army. The flames spread to a nearby building, raising a column of smoke visible for miles. That smoke changed everything. Colonel Barrett had withdrawn his militia across the North Bridge when the British first entered town, taking a defensive position on Punkatasset Hill, about a mile west of the bridge. From there, he watched the British search parties fan out through Concord, while militia companies from surrounding towns continued to arrive at his position. By mid-morning, Barrett commanded between 400 and 500 men, a force now larger than the British contingent in Concord proper. When the smoke began rising from the town center, the men around Barrett saw it as evidence that the British were burning Concord. Lieutenant Joseph Hosmer, Barrett's adjutant, pushed through the crowd of officers to confront his commander. "Will you let them burn the town down?" he demanded. Barrett's answer was to order an advance. He told his men to load their muskets, but not to fire unless fired upon. The column would march to the North Bridge, cross it, and return to Concord to protect the town from destruction. If the British did not oppose them, there would be no fighting. If the British fired first, the militia would defend themselves. At the head of the column marched the Acton Company under Captain Isaac Davis, a 30-year-old farmer and gunsmith whose men were among the best equipped in the American force. Unlike most militia companies, Davis's men carried bayonets, weapons Davis himself had manufactured during the winter. When Barrett asked if Acton would lead the advance, knowing they would bear the brunt of any British fire, Davis replied simply, "I haven't a man who is afraid to go." Davis's wife Hannah would later recall that her husband had been heavy-hearted that morning. Their children were sick with canker rash, a painful infection common in children of the era, and Isaac had paused at the door before leaving to tell her, "Take good care of the children." Then, she said, he was soon out of sight. The American column descended from Punkatasset Hill in military order, drums beating and fifes playing "The White Cockade," an old Jacobite tune that had become associated with the rebel cause. They marched in two files, perhaps 400 men stretching back several hundred yards. The British officers, watching from the North Bridge, found themselves, as one later admitted, impressed with the regularity of the Colonial militia's advance. Captain Laurie, commanding the 3 light infantry companies at the bridge, had a serious problem. His 90-odd soldiers were outnumbered more than 4 to 1, with Parsons' 7 companies still somewhere at Barrett's farm. He sent urgent messages to Lieutenant Colonel Smith requesting reinforcements. None came. As the American column approached, Laurie ordered his men to begin pulling up the planking of the bridge, then stopped when he realized this would strand Parsons on the wrong side of the river. The British formed in what period manuals called street fighting formation, a narrow column designed to concentrate firepower in a confined space. It was not well suited to the open ground around the North Bridge, but Laurie had few options. When the Americans came within about 300 yards, some of his soldiers began firing warning shots into the river. At about 200 yards, they fired a more concentrated volley. Captain Isaac Davis, marching at the head of the American column, took a musket ball through his heart and died instantly. Private Abner Hosmer of Acton, marching beside him, was killed in the same volley. Luther Blanchard, the Acton Company's fiffer, was hit in the side and collapsed with a cry. Major John Buttrick, who had been marching near the front of the column, spun around and shouted the command that transformed a protest march into an armed rebellion. "Fire! Fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" The American front ranks opened fire. It was the first time in the escalating conflict that Colonial militia had fired on British troops while acting under direct orders from an officer. At point-blank range, their concentrated volley was devastating. 3 British soldiers fell dead. 4 of the 8 officers present were wounded. At least 5 more soldiers went down with injuries. The remaining light infantry broke and ran, streaming back toward Concord in disorder. The battle at the North Bridge lasted perhaps 3 minutes. When it was over, the British had suffered their first significant casualties of the day, and the Americans had demonstrated something crucial. Given numerical superiority and the moral justification of responding to fire, they would stand and fight. And yet the Americans did not follow up their advantage. Instead of pursuing the retreating British and threatening to cut off Parsons' companies still returning from Barrett's farm, the militia withdrew from the bridge and returned to the hills to await further developments. Colonel Barrett remained cautious, still uncertain about the broader situation and unwilling to escalate beyond what he saw as defensive action. The 4 British companies returning from Barrett's farm crossed the bridge unmolested about an hour later, passing within yards of the American dead. One of those dead, or perhaps a wounded man struggling to rise, would contribute to the bitterest controversy of the day. A young American, apparently not a member of any organized militia company, approached one of the fallen British soldiers and struck him in the head with a hatchet. The soldier died from the blow. When subsequent British soldiers discovered the body, they believed the man had been scalped. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's official report accused the Americans of having scalped and otherwise ill-treated the wounded. The rumor spread through British ranks and would be used to justify acts of violence during the afternoon's retreat. In fact, no scalping occurred. The hatchet wound simply resembled scalping to soldiers unfamiliar with the practice, but the legend persisted for years and inflamed feelings on both sides. By noon, Lieutenant Colonel Smith had concluded that his position in Concord was untenable. His mission to destroy military supplies had largely failed. Most of the materiel had been moved or hidden before he arrived. His casualties at the North Bridge, while not catastrophic, demonstrated that the militia would fight when provoked. And most worryingly, the American force surrounding Concord continued to grow. Fresh companies were arriving from towns throughout eastern Massachusetts, summoned by the alarm that had spread during the night. Smith could see their numbers increasing on the ridgelines and hills around the town. If he waited much longer, he might not be able to retreat at all. The column began forming up around noon for the march back to Boston. Smith placed his wounded officers in commandeered civilian vehicles, two-wheeled chaises that offered some protection from the rough roads, and organized his most mobile troops, the light infantry, to serve as flankers on either side of the road. These flankers would be crucial. Their job was to clear potential ambush positions ahead of the main column and prevent the Americans from establishing concentrated firing positions along the route. The return march began quietly. The first mile or so passed without incident, the British moving at a steady pace through the Concord countryside. Then, at a small bridge over Elm Brook, at a place called Merriam's Corner, the road bent sharply and the flanking parties had to converge with the main column to cross the water. The Americans were waiting. 500 or more militiamen had positioned themselves behind the Merriam farmhouse, in the barn, along stone walls, and in woodlots on either side of the road. As the British flankers pulled in and the column bunched up at the bridge crossing, the militia opened fire. This first ambush established the pattern for the next 18 miles. The Americans would not stand in open battle against disciplined British volleys and bayonet charges. Instead, they fought from cover behind stone walls that lined the road, from windows and doorways of farmhouses, from woodlots and orchards that dotted the landscape. They fired, fell back, moved to a new position, and fired again. It was an exhausting, terrifying form of warfare for the British, who found themselves taking casualties from an enemy they could rarely see or engage effectively. Lieutenant John Barker of the 4th Regiment of Foot described the experience in his diary. The country was an amazing strong one, full of hills, woods, stone walls, etc., which the rebels did not fail to take advantage of, for they were all lined with people who kept up an incessant, irregular fire upon us. The British flankers proved their worth repeatedly, sweeping ahead to clear ambush positions and giving the column warning of what lay ahead. But the work was exhausting, and the flanking parties had to be rotated frequently as men tired. Every exposed stretch of road brought new dangers. At a place later called the Bloody Angle, where the road made a sharp turn through a narrow valley, perhaps 30 British soldiers fell in quick succession as Americans fired from 3 sides. Captain John Parker was waiting near Lincoln, about 6 miles from Concord. He had spent the morning reassembling his shattered Lexington company, sending messengers to gather those who had scattered after the morning's massacre. Now about 70 men stood with him on a rocky, wooded hillside, overlooking a stretch of road where the terrain forced the British column to pass within easy musket range. Parker positioned his men behind boulders and tree trunks, their weapons loaded and aimed at the road below. When the head of the British column came into view, he waited until the maximum number of soldiers were in his killing zone. Then he gave the order to fire. The concentrated volley from the high ground was devastating. Men fell all along the column. Lieutenant Colonel Smith himself was shot through the thigh and knocked from his horse. Command of the expedition effectively passed to Major Pitcairn, Though Smith remained with the column, carried in one of the commandeered chaises, Parker's men fell back before the British could organize a response, then moved to another position farther down the road to strike again. It was sweet revenge for the humiliation of Lexington Green, and Parker made sure his men knew it. The stretch of road near Lincoln is still known as Parker's Revenge. By mid-afternoon, the British column was in serious trouble. Men were falling with every 100 yards of advance. Ammunition was running low. Many soldiers had expended most of their 36-round allocation. The light infantry flankers were exhausted from constant skirmishing. Officers were down in alarming numbers. And the Americans continued to appear in ever greater strength. Fresh companies arriving from towns as far away as Salem and Danvers, 20 miles from Lexington. Then, around 3 o'clock, the soldiers at the head of the column began cheering. On a rise near Lexington Green, the same ground where 8 Americans had died that morning, stood a new force in perfect formation, Earl Percy's Relief Brigade. 1,000 fresh soldiers with 2 6-pounder artillery pieces, sent from Boston when General Gage received Smith's pre-dawn request for reinforcements. Hugh Percy, 2nd Duke of Northumberland, was 32 years old and one of the most capable officers in Gage's command. He had left Boston around 9 that morning, already running late due to confusion over his orders, and had heard the gunfire for hours as he approached Lexington. What he found, when Smith's battered column staggered into view, was a command on the verge of disintegration. Men were so much exhausted, Percy later reported, that they were scarce able to march. Percy formed his brigade into a defensive square, with the artillery positioned to cover the most dangerous approaches, and gave Smith's survivors 30 minutes to rest, drink from their canteens, and redistribute ammunition. Then he assumed command of the combined force, now about 1,700 soldiers, and prepared to resume the march to Boston. The second half of the retreat was, if anything, worse than the first. Percy's artillery discouraged the Americans from concentrating in large groups, but the militia adapted, spreading out along the roadside in smaller parties and maintaining a continuous harassing fire from concealed positions. Percy's soldiers responded with increasing brutality. Houses along the route were searched, and anyone found inside with a weapon was killed. Taverns were ransacked, their stores of rum consumed by soldiers trying to numb themselves to the chaos around them. The worst fighting occurred in Menotomy, present-day Arlington. The road through the town ran for nearly a mile between houses, barns, and enclosed pastures, perfect ambush terrain. Percy's men found themselves taking fire from windows, doorways, and rooftops. The response was merciless. Soldiers kicked indoors and bayoneted anyone inside. Jason Russell, a 58-year-old man with a disabled leg, was killed on his own doorstep after refusing to abandon his home. When the fighting ended, 10 American bodies lay inside his house and 21 more on his property, the bloodiest single location of the entire day. An elderly man named Samuel Whittemore, variously reported as 78 or 80 years old, took cover behind a stone wall and engaged a group of British grenadiers with his musket and pistols. He shot at 5 soldiers before they reached him. A musket ball struck him in the face. He was bayoneted and left for dead. Remarkably, Whittemore survived and lived to 98, becoming a local legend of patriot resistance. By 6:30 in the evening, the combined British force reached Charlestown Neck, a narrow strip of land connecting the Charlestown Peninsula to the mainland. Percy had made a critical decision to take this route. Rather than returning to Boston via Roxbury, the route passed beneath Bunker Hill and offered the protection of British naval guns from the harbor. As his rear guard established positions on Bunker Hill, Percy sent word to the Charlestown selectmen. There would be no further fighting if the town remained quiet, but any resistance would bring disagreeable consequences. The shooting faded as darkness fell. General William Heath, who had assumed overall command of the American forces during the afternoon, ordered his men to halt their pursuit. Any further attack on the Charlestown position would be suicidal, with British warships covering the approaches. Through the night, Exhausted British soldiers were ferried back to Boston in Navy longboats. They had been awake for nearly 2 days and had marched almost 40 miles, much of it under fire. When dawn broke on the 20th of April 1775, the scope of what had happened became clear. The brief skirmish at Lexington Green and the running battle back to Boston had produced casualty figures that shocked both sides. The British had suffered 73 dead, 174 wounded, and 26 missing, a casualty rate of nearly 40% among the troops engaged. Officers had been particularly hard hit. Of the 18 officers in the light infantry companies that led the initial advance into Lexington, 4 were dead and 9 were wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was recovering from his thigh wound. Major Pitcairn had been thrown from his horse when the animal was shot near Lincoln and would survive to die at Bunker Hill 2 months later. The expedition had utterly failed in its primary mission of destroying American military supplies, and it had transformed a colonial protest movement into an armed rebellion. American casualties were significantly lighter: 49 dead, 39 wounded, and 5 missing, for a total of about 95. 8 men had been killed at Lexington Green, 2 at Northbridge, and the remainder along Battle Road during the afternoon's fighting. The relatively low losses reflected the tactical advantages the Americans had enjoyed: fighting from cover, choosing when to engage and when to withdraw, and operating in familiar terrain against an exhausted enemy. But each death carried its own weight of tragedy. Captain Isaac Davis of Acton left behind his widow Hannah and 4 young children, including an infant only 15 months old. The children had been sick when he left that morning, and Hannah had not even been able to say a proper goodbye. When she received word of his death, she was unable to attend the funeral. All 4 children were too ill to be left alone. Jonathan Harrington of Lexington had crawled across the green to die at his own doorstep, watched by his wife Ruth and their 8-year-old son. The image would haunt the family for generations, becoming one of the iconic stories of the battle. Prince Estabrook, an enslaved man who served in Captain Parker's company, was wounded in the fighting on Lexington Green, the first black man to shed blood in the American Revolution. His fate afterward is unclear, though he may have gained his freedom through military service. At least 35 black men participated in the battles of the 19th of April 1775, some as free men and others as enslaved people fighting alongside their masters. Peter Salem, who would later gain fame at Bunker Hill for allegedly shooting Major Pitcairn, may have been among them. The Revolution would force Americans to confront the contradiction between their rhetoric of liberty and the reality of human bondage, a contradiction that would not be resolved for nearly another century. The British dead were hastily buried by the Americans, who found them along the roadsides. Some bodies were interred where they fell. Others were gathered and placed in common graves. The wounded, who had been too badly hurt to complete the march, were left in Concord and Lexington, where local physicians, including Joseph Warren, who had slipped out of Boston to join the fighting, tended their injuries alongside wounded Americans. The American leadership saw April 19 as a confirmation of their deepest fears and their highest hopes. Samuel Adams, fleeing through the Massachusetts countryside as the shooting began, reportedly exclaimed, "What a glorious morning for America." Whether or not he actually said those words, they captured the spirit of the patriot leadership. The British had fired first, or so the American narrative insisted, and the militia had responded with courage and effectiveness. The revolution had begun. Dr. Joseph Warren immediately recognized the importance of controlling the narrative. Within 4 days of the battle, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had collected scores of sworn depositions from participants and witnesses, all emphasizing British aggression and American restraint. 100 copies of these depositions, along with a carefully crafted narrative of events, were rushed to London by fast schooner. When General Gage's official report finally reached England, the American version had already been circulating in the press for 2 weeks. The propaganda victory was complete. The militia officers who had commanded at Lexington and Concord drew mixed lessons from the experience. Colonel James Barrett had shown that defensive caution could work, but his reluctance to follow up after North Bridge had allowed the British to escape what might have been a devastating trap. General William Heath, who assumed overall command during the afternoon, had coordinated the pursuit effectively, but had also called it off when the British reached Charlestown, a decision that probably prevented additional American casualties, but that some critics considered overly cautious. The British perspective was considerably grimmer. Lieutenant John Barker's diary entries drip with frustration and contempt. He criticized the expedition's leadership. Thus ended this expedition, which from beginning to end was as ill-planned and ill-executed as it was possible to be. He blamed Colonel Smith for slowness and indecision. He expressed surprise and grudging respect for the militia's fighting ability. Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find themselves much mistaken. Earl Percy, who had saved the column from potential destruction, wrote home with a more sober assessment. Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob, he observed, will find himself very much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about, having been employed as rangers axed. The Indians, U-26 Canadians, U-26 this country, being much covered wood and hilly, is very advantageous for their method of fighting. General Gage found himself under attack from all sides. His superior, Lord Dartmouth, had ordered him to take decisive action against the rebels. He had done so, and the result was a military disaster that had united the colonies against British authority more effectively than a decade of parliamentary legislation. Within months, Gage would be recalled to England. His career effectively ended. The civilians of Lexington, Concord, and the towns along Battle Road experienced the day's events in ways that no military report could capture. Hannah Adams, widow of a Lexington farmer, and no relation to Samuel Adams, watched British soldiers march through her town twice, once toward Concord in the morning, once fleeing back toward Boston in the afternoon. The second time, bullets struck her house as the running battle swept past her door. Mary Moulton of Concord pleaded with British soldiers to extinguish a fire that threatened to spread from military debris to civilian buildings. The soldiers complied, saving the town from destruction. When she later applied for a pension based on her service that day, Moulton described herself as being left to the mercy of 600 or 700 armed men, and no person near but an old man of 85 years, and myself 71 years old. Rebecca Barrett, wife of Colonel James Barrett, spent the morning racing through her farmhouse, hiding military supplies from the British search parties she knew would arrive. She concealed musket balls in casks and covered them with feathers, buried ammunition in the garden, and helped plow furrows in the fields where weapons could be hidden. When Captain Parsons' search party arrived, they found almost nothing, and Rebecca Barrett's quick thinking helped ensure that the British mission to destroy colonial military supplies was a near-total failure. The wider political ramifications became clear within days. News of the fighting spread through the colonies with remarkable speed. Riders carried the story to New York in 4 days, to Philadelphia in 5. Everywhere the news arrived, men began to mobilize. Within 2 weeks, perhaps 20,000 militia from across New England had gathered around Boston, trapping Gage's army on the peninsula, and beginning what would become an 11-month siege. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia on the 10th of May, 1775, 3 weeks after Lexington and Concord. The delegates faced a transformed situation. The shooting war had already begun. Within 6 weeks, they would create the Continental Army and appoint George Washington as its commander. The path to independence, still uncertain in April 1775, now seemed increasingly inevitable. The battles of the 19th of April 1775 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of colonial military capacity. The alarm system that Paul Revere had helped establish worked remarkably well, spreading warning across a 40-mile radius in a matter of hours. The militia mobilization was swift and massive. Nearly 4,000 men from Massachusetts alone engaged the British at some point during the day, with thousands more arriving too late to participate. and the tactical effectiveness of fighting from cover, using familiar terrain, and refusing pitched battle proved devastating against a conventional military force. But the American forces also revealed serious weaknesses. There was no unified command structure. Militia companies answered to their own town officers and often ignored orders from officers of other towns. The failure to pursue aggressively after Northbridge allowed the British to escape what might have been an encirclement. Ammunition discipline was poor. An estimated 75,000 shots were fired during the day, with a hit rate well under 1%. And the rage that drove some Americans to kill wounded British soldiers or to mutilate corpses suggested that discipline might break down entirely in a prolonged conflict. The British learned equally important lessons, though they were slow to apply them. The assumption that colonial militia would scatter at the first sign of professional soldiers proved catastrophically wrong. The difficulty of operating in hostile countryside against an aroused population was greater than anyone in London had anticipated. And the logistical challenges of maintaining an army 3,000 miles from home, in a country where the civilian population was increasingly hostile, would only grow worse as the conflict expanded. Weather had played its role as well. The very pleasant evening of April 18 had allowed the alarm riders to travel quickly over dry roads. The clear, cool morning of April 1946 degrees at dawn, rising to about 52 by afternoon, was ideal for military operations. A heavy rain would have dampened powder, fouled muskets, and transformed the roads into muddy quagmires that might have slowed the British retreat to a crawl. The Americans were fortunate in their weather, though they may not have recognized it at the time. Intelligence failures occurred on both sides. The British expedition had lost all element of surprise before it even left Boston, thanks to the Patriot spy network operating under Joseph Warren's coordination. Yet the Americans themselves had incomplete intelligence about British objectives and strength, leading to confusion about whether the column was headed for Concord, Lexington, or both. The fog of war descended early and never lifted. The question of who fired first at Lexington Green remained contentious immediately after the battle and has never been definitively resolved. Both sides had clear incentives to blame the other. The American depositions, rushed into print for propaganda purposes, uniformly claimed British soldiers fired first. The British accounts, written by officers who had ordered their men not to fire, insisted the first shot came from Americans behind a stone wall or inside the meeting house. Modern analysis suggests the truth may be more complex than either side admitted. The available evidence is consistent with an accidental discharge, a weapon going off unexpectedly in the tense standoff, followed by reflexive firing from startled soldiers on both sides. Neither Captain Parker nor Major Pitcairn had ordered their men to fire, and both struggled to restore order once the shooting started. The identity of the individual who pulled that first trigger is almost certainly lost to history. The immediate aftermath of the 19th of April, 1775, transformed the political landscape of British North America. What had been a dispute about parliamentary authority and colonial rights became an armed conflict with no clear path to resolution. Within hours of the fighting, thousands of militia began converging on the roads leading to Boston, trapping General Gage's army on the peninsula and beginning the siege of Boston. By the end of April, perhaps 16,000 New England militiamen had established positions surrounding the city. They came from every colony in New England, Massachusetts men and Connecticut men, soldiers from New Hampshire and Rhode Island united in opposition to British military action. They lacked uniforms, standardized equipment, proper supply lines, or coordinated command. But they had numbers, they had determination, and they had demonstrated at Lexington and Concord that they would fight. General Artemus Ward assumed command of the American forces on April 20, the day after the battle. He faced immediate challenges: feeding, housing, and organizing thousands of men who had arrived with enthusiasm but little preparation for prolonged military service. Ammunition was critically short. Artillery was almost non-existent. The New England Army was more an armed mob than a disciplined military force. Yet the British situation was worse. Gage found himself commander of an army under siege, cut off from the countryside that provided food and fodder, dependent entirely on naval supply lines that could be disrupted by bad weather. His reputation had been destroyed by the failed expedition. Politicians in London, who had encouraged him to take firm action, now blamed him for the disaster their policies had produced. He would be recalled within months, replaced by William Howe. The propaganda war continued alongside the military standoff. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress rushed its collection of depositions to London, where sympathetic members of Parliament ensured wide distribution. The American version of events, British soldiers firing without provocation on peaceful colonists attempting to disperse, dominated the British press before Gage's official report even arrived. When the government's account finally appeared, it seemed defensive and unconvincing. The Second Continental Congress, which convened in Philadelphia on May 10, inherited a war that had already begun. The delegates included many who still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord made compromise increasingly difficult. On June 14, Congress voted to create a Continental Army from the militia forces besieging Boston. The next day, they unanimously appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, as commander-in-chief. The choice of Washington was strategic as well as military. Placing a Virginian at the head of what had been a New England army signaled that resistance to British authority was not merely a regional phenomenon, but a continental cause. Washington departed immediately for Massachusetts, arriving at Cambridge on July 3 to assume command of an army of approximately 17,000 men. The siege continued through the summer and fall of 1775, punctuated by the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17. That engagement, actually fought on nearby Breed's Hill, demonstrated both the courage of American troops and the British willingness to absorb devastating casualties to achieve their objectives. The British took the hill but lost more than 1,000 men killed and wounded, nearly half the force engaged. Among the American dead was Dr. Joseph Warren, who had sent Paul Revere on his midnight ride, and who had been commissioned as a major general only days before. He died leading troops in the final assault. The war would continue for 8 more years, expanding from a New England conflict into a global struggle involving France, Spain, and the Netherlands. The armies that fought at Yorktown in 1781 bore little resemblance to the militia companies that had assembled on Lexington Green or marched down to Northbridge. But the revolution that created the United States began there, on that April morning, when ordinary men decided to stand their ground against the most powerful empire in the world. The legacy of Lexington and Concord extends far beyond the military events of the 19th of April 1775. Those events became foundational stories of American national identity, told and retold in ways that shaped how generations of Americans understood themselves and their country. Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose grandfather, William Emerson, had watched the fighting at North Bridge from the upstairs window of the Old Manse, gave the battle its most enduring poetic expression. His Concord hymn, written for the dedication of a monument at North Bridge on the 4th of July, 1837, includes the famous line, "Here once the embattled farmer stood, and fired the shot heard round the world." The phrase perfectly captured the sense that events at this obscure Massachusetts village had somehow changed the course of human history. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, published in 1861 as the American Civil War began, created the legend of the Midnight Ride that most Americans know today. Longfellow's Revere rides alone through the sleeping countryside, watching for the lantern signal in the Old North Church, shouting his warning from farmstead to farmstead. The poem is magnificent literature and terrible history. Revere did not ride alone, did not watch for the signal he had ordered set, did not shout, "The British are coming," and did not even complete his ride to Concord. But Longfellow's purpose was not historical accuracy. Writing on the eve of Civil War, he sought to inspire his readers with an image of courageous action in a time of national crisis. He succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The military lessons of the 19th of April 1775 influenced American military thinking for generations. The effectiveness of militia fighting from cover against regular troops in difficult terrain became a template for American defensive strategy, employed in conflicts from the American Revolution through the Vietnam War. The importance of warning networks and civilian mobilization remained central to American defense planning well into the 20th century. Today, the battles of Lexington and Concord are commemorated annually on Patriots' Day, a Massachusetts state holiday observed on the third Monday of April. The holiday itself emerged from the long-running dispute between Lexington and Concord over which town could claim the honor of firing the first shot of the Revolution. In 1894, Lexington petitioned the state legislature to establish Lexington Day as an official holiday. Concord objected. The compromise was Patriots' Day, honoring both communities without settling the historical question. The Minuteman National Historical Park preserves key sites along Battle Road, including the North Bridge, the Hartwell Tavern, and several witness houses that stood on the 19th of April, 1775. The famous Minuteman statue, erected at Concord in 1875, depicts an anonymous farmer setting down his plow to take up his musket, an image that captures the revolutionary mythology, even if it simplifies the historical reality. The 250th anniversary of the battles, observed in April 2025, brought more than 750 living history volunteers from the United States and Great Britain to recreate the events along Battle Road. They wore period-accurate uniforms, carried reproduction muskets, and demonstrated the tactics that both sides had employed 2.5 centuries earlier. The commemorations reminded participants that the events of the 19th of April 1775, while distant in time, remain relevant to contemporary questions about citizenship, resistance, and the meaning of liberty. Those questions have no simple answers, and the historical reality of Lexington and Concord offers no simple lessons. The embattled farmers were not always noble or disciplined. Some committed acts of violence against wounded enemies that horrified contemporary observers on both sides. The British soldiers were not uniformly brutal. Many officers tried to prevent atrocities and protected civilian property when they could. The revolution that began that April morning would ultimately deliver independence for some Americans while leaving others enslaved black people, Native Americans, women excluded from the promise of liberty that the Declaration of Independence would proclaim 15 months later. What happened at Lexington and Concord was, in the end, a collision between imperfect human beings acting under pressure, with incomplete information, guided by principles they understood differently and expressed in contradictory ways. Some of them, Jonas Parker, Isaac Davis, the unnamed British soldiers who fell at North Bridge, paid for that collision with their lives. Others, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, the men who would gather in Philadelphia to debate independence, survived to shape the nation that emerged from the conflict. The shot heard round the world was not a single shot at all, but a ragged exchange of gunfire on a village green in Massachusetts, followed by more gunfire at a wooden bridge over a small river, followed by 18 miles of running battle through the New England countryside. It announced no clear message and established no obvious truth. It simply announced that an argument had become a war, and that the world would never be quite the same again. In Lexington, Massachusetts, there is a small stone monument near the spot where Jonas Parker fell. It does not record his famous declaration that he would never run, or the details of his death, or the larger significance of what happened there. It simply marks the place where a man made a choice, stood his ground, and became part of a story that Americans have been telling ever since. That story is complicated, contradictory, and incomplete. It is also ours, and we are still living with its consequences, 250 years after that cold April dawn when the shooting started and everything changed.